Hey guys, tonight we're diving into something that'll make you question everything you think you know about human intelligence. Picture this: you're standing in ancient Egypt, watching the most sophisticated civilization on Earth smear crocodile dung on their faces, convinced it's the secret to eternal youth. But here's the kicker: by the end of this video, you'll discover that one of these ridiculous superstitions actually saved millions of lives, and modern science is still trying to figure out why it worked. You probably won't survive hearing about the medieval practice of drilling holes in skulls to cure headaches, or how entire European cities avoided bathing for centuries because they genuinely believed water would kill them. In a couple of minutes, you'll find out how a simple tomato nearly destroyed the aristocracy, and why your ancestors were absolutely terrified of left-handed children. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Drop a comment with your location and what time you're listening. I love seeing where in the world you're joining me for these midnight history sessions. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're walking through the bustling markets of ancient Memphis, the air thick with incense, and the chatter of merchants hawking their wares. The year is 1500 BC. And you've just witnessed something that would make any modern dermatologist faint. Wealthy Egyptian women are literally paying premium prices for fresh crocodile excrement to slather across their faces like the world's most expensive face mask. But here's where it gets interesting. These weren't ignorant people stumbling around in the dark. The Egyptians had mastered mathematics, built monuments that still baffle engineers today, and developed medical procedures so advanced that some are still used in modern surgery. Yet they genuinely believed that the digestive waste of Nile crocodiles held the secret to preventing wrinkles and maintaining youthful skin. The logic, twisted as it seems to us now, actually made a certain kind of sense within their worldview. Crocodiles were revered as sacred animals, embodying the god Sobek's power over fertility and protection. These creatures lived for decades without showing obvious signs of aging, their scales remaining tough and pristine. To the Egyptian mind, if you wanted to capture that timeless resilience, you needed to literally absorb the essence of the crocodile. And what could be more essentially crocodile than its fresh waste? Historians still argue whether this practice was limited to the wealthy elite, or if common people had their own versions using more accessible animal droppings. What we do know is that the process was elaborate and expensive. Professional dung collectors would venture into crocodile-infested waters, risking life and limb to gather the freshest specimens. The excrement was then mixed with honey, oils, and various herbs to create what they called divine paste. The application ritual was equally complex. Women would fast for a day, purify themselves in the Nile, and then have trained servants apply the mixture in specific patterns across their faces. They believed the crocodile's spiritual power would seep through their skin, not just preventing aging but actually reversing it. Some papyrus texts suggest they thought the treatment could add years to their lives. Here's the truly mind-bending part. Recent archaeological analysis of mummified skin from wealthy Egyptian women shows unusually high levels of certain minerals and compounds that modern cosmetics use for anti-aging properties. The crocodile dung, it turns out, was rich in natural alpha-hydroxy acids, the same ingredients in today's expensive chemical peels. But the Egyptians weren't the only ones convinced that animal waste held miraculous properties. Roman women, not to be outdone in the pursuit of beauty, developed their own fecal face treatments using nightingale droppings imported from Japan. They called it igisa no fun, and wealthy Roman matrons would pay fortunes for this exotic bird waste, believing it would give them the porcelain complexion of Eastern goddesses. The practice spread throughout the ancient world with regional variations. Greek women preferred sheep dung mixed with wine, while Celtic tribes in Britain used horse manure combined with fermented berries. Each culture developed elaborate mythologies around their chosen animal waste, creating complex rituals and taboos around collection, preparation, and application. What's particularly fascinating is how these practices persisted for centuries, passed down through generations of women who swore by their effectiveness. Mothers would teach daughters the family recipe, and wealthy households would employ specialists whose sole job was maintaining the supply of properly aged animal excrement for cosmetic purposes. The decline of dung-based beauty treatments didn't come from scientific enlightenment, but from changing religious beliefs. As Christianity spread through the Roman Empire, church leaders began condemning these practices as pagan rituals that invited demonic possession. They preached that true beauty came from spiritual purity, not from smearing animal waste on your face. Yet even as the practice faded in Europe, it continued in other parts of the world. Traditional Chinese medicine incorporated various animal droppings into beauty treatments well into the Ming Dynasty, and some remote communities in Southeast Asia maintained these traditions until the early 20th century. You're sitting in a medieval monastery, the stone walls echoing with the sound of monks chanting their morning prayers, when suddenly Brother Thomas lets out a tremendous sneeze that reverberates through the chapel. But instead of the polite, "Bless you," you might expect, chaos erupts. Monks scramble over each other, frantically making the sign of the cross, shouting Latin incantations, and one even begins sprinkling holy water in Thomas's direction. Why? Because they genuinely believed his soul had just been violently ejected from his body, leaving him vulnerable to demonic possession. This wasn't just medieval paranoia. This terror of sneezing stretched back thousands of years and across virtually every culture on Earth. The ancient Greeks believed that sneezing was a divine message, but also a dangerous moment, when your life force temporarily abandoned your physical form. Romans developed elaborate rituals around sneezing, with specific prayers for different times of day and different social situations. A morning sneeze required different protection than an evening one, and sneezing in the presence of nobility demanded its own special ceremonial response. The mechanics of their fear were surprisingly sophisticated. Medieval scholars taught that the human soul resided primarily in the breath, flowing in and out with each inhalation and exhalation. A sneeze, being such a violent and uncontrollable expulsion of air, was essentially your soul being ripped from your body by invisible forces. During those few seconds when your soul was displaced, evil spirits could slip in and take control, turning you into a vessel for demonic influence. But here's where the medieval mind gets truly creative. They developed an entire classification system for different types of sneezes and their spiritual implications. A single sneeze meant your guardian angel was trying to warn you of danger. 2 sneezes indicated that evil spirits were testing your defenses. 3 sneezes? That was considered so catastrophically dangerous that some monasteries would immediately begin exorcism procedures, convinced the person was already partially possessed. The "bless you" response wasn't just politeness. It was literally a magical incantation designed to slam your soul back into your body before demons could take residence. Different cultures developed their own versions. Germans said Gesundheit, health, believing the blessing needed to focus on physical protection. Italians used salute, salvation, emphasizing spiritual safety. The Spanish developed Jesus, invoking Christ's direct intervention against supernatural attack. Historians still argue whether the plague pandemic of the 14th century intensified these beliefs or if the sneezing superstitions actually helped identify early plague symptoms. What's certain is that during the Black Death, a sneeze could literally be a death sentence, not from demons, but from immediate social isolation as communities banished anyone showing respiratory symptoms. The fear became so ingrained that people developed elaborate techniques to prevent sneezing altogether. Medieval medical texts recommended everything from pressing your tongue against the roof of your mouth to staring directly at bright lights to shock the sneeze back into submission. Wealthy nobles employed servants whose job was to monitor their breathing patterns and provide immediate spiritual protection the moment a sneeze seemed imminent. Some cultures took the opposite approach, believing that suppressing a sneeze was even more dangerous than letting it happen. They thought holding in a sneeze could trap evil spirits inside your body permanently, leading to madness, illness, or death. This created a terrifying catch-22, sneeze and risk demonic possession, or hold it in and guarantee spiritual contamination. The superstition evolved into complex social etiquette. In medieval courts, sneezing in the presence of royalty without proper ritual acknowledgement was considered treason. You were essentially allowing demons to infiltrate the royal presence. Court physicians developed elaborate protocols for managing royal sneezes, including specific prayers, incense burning, and sometimes even temporary evacuation of the throne room until proper spiritual cleansing could be performed. Religious authorities capitalized on these fears, teaching that frequent sneezing was a sign of insufficient faith or hidden sin. They sold blessed amulets designed to prevent sneezing, holy oils to anoint the nostrils, and special prayers to recite before entering situations where sneezing might occur. The Catholic Church even developed a formal blessing ceremony for chronic sneezers, treating their condition as a form of spiritual affliction requiring divine intervention. The most extreme cases involved people who became so terrified of sneezing that they developed what we now recognize as severe anxiety disorders. They would isolate themselves from society, cover their faces with blessed cloths, and spend hours in prayer trying to prevent the demonic vulnerability that sneezing represented. Some medieval accounts describe people literally dying from the stress of trying to control their natural bodily functions. What's particularly fascinating is how this superstition created its own self-fulfilling prophecy. The intense anxiety around sneezing actually made people more likely to sneeze. Stress and fear are known triggers for the reflex. So the more terrified someone became of demonic possession through sneezing, the more they would sneeze, reinforcing their belief that evil forces were actively targeting them. The decline of sneezing superstitions came gradually with the rise of scientific medicine, but even today, the automatic, "bless you," response persists in cultures worldwide. We've forgotten the demonic possession fears, but we still feel compelled to acknowledge someone's sneeze with protective words, a ghostly echo of our ancestors' terror that a simple bodily function could invite supernatural catastrophe. You're standing in the marble halls of ancient Rome, watching Senator Marcus Aurelius Maximus prepare for the most important speech of his political career. But instead of reviewing his notes, or practicing his rhetoric, he's doing something that would make any modern person gag. He's carefully drinking a goblet of his own warm urine, convinced it will sharpen his mind and give him the divine eloquence needed to sway the Senate. Welcome to the world where pee wasn't just waste. It was liquid gold, medicine, and magic all rolled into one revolting package. This wasn't some fringe practice by desperate outcasts. Urine therapy was mainstream medicine for over 2,000 years, prescribed by the most respected physicians from Rome to Renaissance Europe. The logic seemed unshakable. Your body had already processed this liquid once, extracting the good stuff and leaving behind a concentrated essence of your vital forces. Drinking it back was like recycling your own life energy, creating a perfect closed loop of health and vitality. Roman physicians developed an entire medical system around urine analysis and consumption. They believed that different times of day produced urine with different healing properties. Morning urine was best for digestive issues, afternoon urine cured headaches, and midnight urine could allegedly restore youth. They even categorized urine by color, smell, and taste, creating elaborate charts that matched specific urine characteristics to particular ailments. But here's where it gets truly bizarre. They didn't just drink their own. Roman doctors prescribed drinking the urine of healthy young people to cure diseases in the elderly, believing that youth could be literally transferred through liquid. Wealthy Romans would pay premium prices for the urine of Olympic athletes, convinced that consuming it would grant them superhuman strength and endurance. Some even imported urine from distant lands, thinking that foreign pee contained exotic healing properties unavailable in local varieties. The practice exploded during medieval times when European physicians elevated urine therapy to an art form. They called it uroscopy, and developed incredibly sophisticated diagnostic techniques based entirely on examining and tasting patients' urine. Medieval doctors could allegedly determine everything from pregnancy to impending death just by swirling a sample around their mouth and analyzing the flavor profile. Historians still argue whether medieval urine therapy actually provided any medical benefits, or if its popularity was purely based on placebo effects and desperate hope. What's undeniable is that some of history's most brilliant minds swore by it. Leonardo da Vinci reportedly drank his own urine daily, claiming it enhanced his artistic vision. Paracelsus, the father of modern toxicology, wrote extensively about urine's healing properties and prescribed it for everything from plague to heartbreak. The medieval Catholic Church initially condemned urine drinking as a pagan practice, but eventually embraced it when monks discovered they could use it to treat various ailments without breaking their vows of poverty. After all, urine was free and always available. Monastery infirmaries developed their own urine-based remedies, with different monastic orders specializing in different preparation methods. Some fermented it like wine, others distilled it like spirits, and a few even aged it in blessed barrels for enhanced spiritual potency. The most extreme practitioners took urine therapy to horrifying lengths. Some medieval physicians prescribed drinking the urine of specific animals for different conditions: horse urine for strength, cat urine for agility, and pig urine for fertility. They even developed complex mixing formulas, combining human and animal urine in precise ratios to create what they called compound elixirs, that could allegedly cure any disease known to mankind. Women's urine was considered especially powerful, particularly from pregnant women or virgins. Medieval medical texts claimed that virgins' urine could cure male impotence, while pregnant women's urine could prevent miscarriages in other women. This created a bizarre black market where wealthy families would pay young women for their urine, leading to elaborate fraud schemes involving fake virgins and staged pregnancies. The practice reached its peak during the Renaissance when European courts employed official watercasters, physicians whose sole job was analyzing royal urine and prescribing appropriate treatments. These specialists commanded enormous salaries and wielded significant political influence, since they supposedly held the key to maintaining the monarch's health and longevity. Some royal urine analysts became so powerful that they could influence succession decisions by declaring certain heirs spiritually contaminated, based on their urine quality. But the most disturbing aspect was how urine therapy became intertwined with social class and religious purity. The wealthy believed that drinking the urine of holy people could grant spiritual enlightenment, leading to exploitation of monks, nuns, and religious hermits who were essentially farmed for their bodily waste. Some religious communities even developed elaborate hierarchies based on whose urine was considered most sacred and healing. The decline of urine therapy began in the 17th century as scientific medicine started understanding actual disease mechanisms, but it didn't disappear entirely. Even today, some alternative medicine practitioners promote urine therapy, claiming it boosts immunity and cures chronic diseases. The difference is that modern urine enthusiasts at least understand basic hygiene, unlike our ancestors who shared communal urine goblets and stored their liquid medicine in the same containers they used for wine. Remember that crocodile dung face mask from ancient Egypt? At least the Egyptians were only putting waste on their skin. Medieval Europeans were so convinced of urine's healing power that they were literally drinking their way to health, one disgusting gulp at a time, creating a medical tradition so persistent that it took centuries of scientific advancement to finally flush it away. You're watching a medieval classroom where a 7-year-old boy named William sits trembling at his wooden desk, his left hand bound tightly behind his back with rough rope that's already cutting into his wrists. The monk standing over him holds a wooden rod, ready to strike every time William's natural instincts betray him, and he reaches for his quill with the devil's hand. This isn't punishment for misbehavior. This is salvation. Because in medieval Europe, being left-handed wasn't just inconvenient or unusual, it was proof that Satan himself had marked you as his own. The terror of left-handedness ran so deep that the very word sinister comes from the Latin word for left, while dexterous derives from dexter, meaning right. This wasn't coincidental wordplay. Medieval Christians genuinely believed that the left side of the human body was Satan's territory, while the right belonged to God. Every left-handed child was seen as a walking advertisement for demonic influence, a living reminder that evil forces were actively recruiting among the innocent. Medieval theologians developed elaborate explanations for why the devil preferred left-handed servants. They taught that when Lucifer fell from heaven, he landed on his left side, forever cursing that direction with his malevolent presence. Biblical scholars pointed to passages describing the righteous sitting at God's right hand while the damned were cast to the left, creating a cosmic geography where left literally meant evil and right meant holy. But the persecution went far beyond theological theory. Medieval parents would tie their children's left hands behind their backs for months, force them to sleep on their right sides, and even burn the fingertips of the left hand to make using it too painful to consider. Some communities employed professional hand correctors, specialists who used increasingly brutal methods to force left-handed children into right-handed conformity, believing they were literally saving souls from eternal damnation. The Catholic Church institutionalized this persecution through official doctrine. Left-handed people were banned from becoming priests, since using the devil's hand to perform sacred rituals would contaminate the holy sacraments. They couldn't serve as altar boys, handle religious artifacts, or even touch blessed objects without special purification ceremonies. Some dioceses required left-handed converts to undergo exorcism before baptism, treating their handedness as a form of demonic possession that needed to be cast out. Historians still argue whether the persecution of left-handed people contributed to the broader witch hunt hysteria that swept through Europe, but the connections are undeniable. Many accused witches were left-handed, and inquisitors specifically looked for left-handedness as evidence of supernatural corruption. Trial records show that being left-handed could be used as supporting evidence for witchcraft charges, since it proved the accused had already been marked by Satan. The social consequences were devastating. Left-handed people faced discrimination in every aspect of medieval life. They couldn't join guilds, marry into respectable families, or hold positions of authority. Many learned to hide their natural handedness so completely that they developed ambidextrous abilities out of pure survival instinct. Others suffered permanent physical damage from forced conversion attempts, ending up with mangled hands that couldn't function properly with either side. Medieval medicine added its own layer of horror to the persecution. Physicians taught that left-handedness was a symptom of humoral imbalance, too much cold, wet phlegm in the brain that needed to be burned out through aggressive treatment. They prescribed bloodletting from the left arm, hot iron applications to the left temple, and even trepanation, drilling holes in the left side of the skull to release the demonic vapors that caused the unnatural hand preference. The most extreme cases involved entire communities organizing to cure left-handed children through collective intervention. Villages would hold public ceremonies where left-handed children were forced to perform right-handed tasks while the entire population prayed for their spiritual healing. Failure to show improvement was seen as evidence that the child was actively resisting God's grace, leading to even more severe punishment and social ostracism. Some medieval scholars developed elaborate theories about left-handedness being hereditary, leading to the persecution of entire family lines. If one child was left-handed, authorities would monitor all siblings for signs of similar corruption. Parents of left-handed children faced suspicion and social isolation, accused of harboring demonic influences in their households or practicing secret pagan rituals that attracted Satan's attention. The persecution created its own underground culture of left-handed people who developed secret signals and hidden communities. They learned to recognize each other through subtle gestures and created informal networks for sharing survival strategies. Some became traveling performers or entertainers, using their cursed handedness as a novelty act while secretly connecting with other left-handed outcasts. Religious authorities even developed special prayers and rituals designed to cleanse spaces that had been contaminated by left-handed presence. Churches would be reconsecrated after left-handed people attended services, and some communities required left-handed individuals to enter through separate doors and sit in designated purification sections, away from the righteous right-handed congregation. The irony is that many of history's greatest artists, inventors, and thinkers were left-handed, but they had to hide their natural abilities or risk persecution. Leonardo da Vinci famously wrote backwards to conceal his left-handedness, while other left-handed geniuses developed elaborate techniques to appear right-handed in public, while secretly using their dominant hand for their most important work. This wasn't just medieval ignorance. The persecution of left-handed people continued well into the 20th century in some Christian communities, with children still being forced into painful conversion therapy as recently as the 1960s. The same superstitions that convinced our ancestors to drink their own urine and smear crocodile dung on their faces also created centuries of systematic torture for the simple crime of being born with a different dominant hand. You're standing in an ancient Roman villa, watching as the household slaves frantically scrub every surface, burn incense in every corner, and even replace the drinking water, all because the master's wife has just started her monthly cycle. But this isn't about hygiene or comfort. The Romans genuinely believed that menstruating women possessed such devastating supernatural power that they could wilt entire vineyards with a glance, turn fresh wine into vinegar by walking past it, and kill livestock simply by being in their presence. Welcome to a world where half the population was considered a monthly weapon of mass destruction. This terror of menstrual blood wasn't limited to superstitious peasants. It was codified into law, medicine, and religious doctrine across virtually every ancient civilization. Pliny the Elder, one of Rome's most respected natural philosophers, wrote extensively about the apocalyptic dangers posed by menstruating women. According to his carefully documented observations, menstrual blood could rust iron, dull mirrors, kill bees, cause dogs to go rabid, and even make seeds sterile just by proximity. The ancient Hebrews developed the most elaborate system of menstrual isolation, requiring women to live in separate quarters for 7 days during their cycle, then undergo purification rituals before rejoining society. But even after purification, they remained spiritually contaminated for another 7 days, meaning that for nearly half of every month, women were considered walking sources of divine pollution that could contaminate anything they touched. Medieval Christians took these fears to even more extreme lengths. They taught that menstruating women couldn't enter churches, touch holy objects, or even look at the communion wine without causing it to spoil. Some dioceses required special blessing ceremonies for any space that had been contaminated by menstrual presence, treating women's natural cycles as a form of demonic influence that required divine intervention to cleanse. But here's where the medieval mind gets truly creative. They believed menstrual blood was so magically potent that it could be weaponized. Witchcraft manuals described elaborate spells using menstrual blood to curse enemies, control weather, and even raise the dead. This created a terrifying paradox. Women were simultaneously feared for their natural biological functions and accused of deliberately using those functions for supernatural warfare. The agricultural implications were catastrophic for women's social status. Farming communities genuinely believed that menstruating women could destroy entire harvests just by walking through fields. During planting season, women were often confined to their homes or forced to wear special amulets designed to contain their destructive power. Some villages employed cycle watchers, elderly women whose job was monitoring the menstrual status of all fertile females to prevent agricultural disasters. Experts remain split on whether these beliefs originated from genuine observations of coincidental crop failures or if they were deliberately constructed to justify female subjugation. What's certain is that the superstitions created elaborate economic systems around female isolation. Wealthy families built separate, red tents, or menstrual huts where women would spend their cycles in quarantine, while poorer families simply banished women to sleep outdoors during their monthly periods. Medieval medicine added its own layer of horror to menstrual superstitions. Physicians taught that menstrual blood was literally toxic waste, the body's way of expelling poisonous humors that would otherwise kill the woman. They believed this toxic blood retained its deadly properties even after leaving the body, remaining dangerous for days or weeks. Medical texts warned that even dried menstrual blood could contaminate water supplies, spoil food, and cause plague outbreaks. The most extreme practitioners developed elaborate protection rituals for dealing with menstruating women. Some communities required women to wear bells during their cycles so others could avoid contamination, while others forced them to cover their faces and hands to prevent their deadly gaze from affecting innocent bystanders. Certain medieval towns even had special, menstrual gates, where cycling women had to enter and exit separately from the general population. Religious authorities capitalized on these fears by selling blessed amulets, holy oils, and special prayers designed to protect communities from menstrual contamination. They developed complex theological explanations for why God had cursed women with such destructive monthly cycles, teaching that menstruation was divine punishment for Eve's original sin that would continue until the end of times. The superstitions created their own self-fulfilling prophecies. Women who were constantly told they were dangerous and contaminated during their cycles often developed severe anxiety and depression around menstruation. Some became so convinced of their own destructive power that they would isolate themselves voluntarily, believing they were protecting their families and communities from supernatural harm. The most disturbing aspect was how these beliefs affected medical care. Women experiencing difficult or irregular periods were often accused of practicing witchcraft or harboring demonic influences. Instead of receiving treatment, they faced exorcism, bloodletting, or even execution if their menstrual irregularities coincided with local disasters or crop failures. Some cultures developed elaborate mythologies around menstrual blood's supposed magical properties. They believed it could be used to create love potions, poison enemies, or communicate with supernatural entities. This led to black market trading in menstrual blood, with some women selling their monthly discharge to practitioners of dark magic while others lived in terror that their biological waste might be stolen for malevolent purposes. The decline of menstrual superstitions came gradually with scientific understanding of human biology, but remnants persist even today in some traditional communities. The same mindset that convinced our ancestors that left-handed children were marked by Satan and that drinking urine could cure diseases also created centuries of systematic oppression based on the simple biological reality of female reproductive cycles. Remember that terrified monk sprinkling holy water after Brother Thomas sneezed? At least his fear was based on a voluntary bodily function. Medieval women faced persecution and isolation for something completely beyond their control, turning half the population into monthly pariahs in a world already convinced that supernatural forces lurked behind every natural phenomenon. You're walking through the cobblestone streets of medieval Paris, and something immediately strikes you as wrong. The overwhelming stench isn't just from garbage and sewage, it's from the people themselves. Nobles in silk robes reek like they haven't washed in months, because they literally haven't. Merchants conducting business smell so putrid that you can barely stand downwind of them. Even the clergy, supposedly devoted to spiritual purity, emit odors that would make a modern person vomit. This isn't poverty or laziness. This is deliberate. Because for over 500 years, Europeans genuinely believed that bathing would kill them. The logic seemed ironclad to medieval minds. Your skin was covered in protective layers of dirt, oil, and grime that formed a natural barrier against disease. Washing this away would open your pores, creating tiny doorways through which deadly plague vapors could enter your body and poison your blood. Clean skin wasn't healthy skin. It was vulnerable skin, practically inviting death to seep through every freshly scrubbed pore. Medieval physicians developed elaborate theories about how water weakened the body's natural defenses. They taught that hot baths were particularly dangerous because heat expanded the pores even further, while cold water shocked the system and disrupted the delicate balance of bodily humors. The safest approach was to avoid water entirely, relying instead on dry cleaning methods like rubbing with cloth or scraping away surface dirt with wooden tools. The Catholic Church added religious justification to these medical fears, teaching that excessive concern with bodily cleanliness was a form of vanity that distracted from spiritual purity. Saints were praised for their holy stench, with unwashed bodies seen as evidence of devotion to higher matters. Some monasteries even banned bathing entirely, considering it a form of self-indulgence that weakened monks' spiritual resolve and made them susceptible to carnal temptations. But here's where medieval hygiene gets truly bizarre. They developed elaborate alternatives to washing that were somehow considered safer than water. Wealthy nobles would change their linen undergarments frequently, believing that fresh cloth could absorb bodily impurities without the dangerous pore-opening effects of bathing. They rubbed themselves with perfumed powders, applied scented oils, and even used live animals. Some aristocrats kept small dogs specifically to attract fleas and lice away from their own bodies. The fear of bathing created an entire industry around dry cleaning methods. Professional body scrapers used specialized tools to remove surface dirt without water contact. Barbers offered services that included scraping, rubbing, and powder application, but never actual washing. Some entrepreneurs sold dry baths, elaborate procedures involving heated sand, aromatic herbs, and vigorous rubbing that promised all the benefits of cleanliness without the deadly risks of water exposure. Contemporary analysis suggests conflicting theories about whether the anti-bathing movement actually contributed to disease outbreaks, or if the correlation was purely coincidental. What's undeniable is that the practice created cascading social and medical consequences that shaped European culture for centuries. Public bathhouses, which had been common during Roman times, disappeared almost entirely as communities became convinced that communal bathing was essentially mass suicide. The most extreme practitioners took water avoidance to horrifying lengths. Some medieval nobles boasted about never having been fully immersed in water since their baptism as infants. They developed elaborate clothing systems designed to hide and contain bodily odors, wearing multiple layers of fabric that could be changed without ever exposing skin to cleaning. Certain aristocratic families employed servants whose sole job was managing the complex logistics of staying dirty while maintaining social appearances. Medieval medicine added its own layer of complexity to bathing fears. Physicians prescribed specific schedules for when limited washing might be acceptable, usually only during certain phases of the moon or particular seasons when the body's humors were supposedly strong enough to withstand water's weakening effects. They developed detailed charts correlating astrological conditions with safe bathing windows, treating cleanliness as a dangerous medical procedure that required careful timing and professional supervision. The superstition created bizarre social hierarchies based on degrees of filthiness. The dirtiest people were often considered the healthiest and most spiritually pure, while anyone who appeared too clean faced suspicion of vanity, witchcraft, or dangerous foreign influences. Some communities developed informal competitions to see who could go longest without washing, treating extreme filthiness as a badge of honor and spiritual achievement. Religious authorities capitalized on these fears by selling blessed oils and holy powders that could supposedly provide protection without requiring dangerous water contact. They developed elaborate blessing ceremonies for the rare occasions when bathing was deemed absolutely necessary, treating the procedure like a dangerous medical operation that required divine intervention to prevent fatal consequences. The most disturbing aspect was how anti-bathing beliefs affected medical treatment. Sick people were often denied any form of cleaning, even when covered in their own waste or infected wounds. Physicians believed that washing diseased bodies would spread the illness internally, so patients were left to fester in their own filth while doctors applied increasingly bizarre external treatments that avoided any water contact. Some medieval communities developed elaborate rituals around the rare occasions when bathing was unavoidable. They would hold public ceremonies before and after, with prayers, incense burning, and sometimes even temporary quarantine for anyone who had been exposed to the dangerous cleansing process. The person who had bathed was often monitored for days afterward to ensure they hadn't succumbed to the deadly effects of clean skin. The decline of anti-bathing superstitions began during the Renaissance as trade with cleaner cultures introduced new ideas about hygiene, but the transition was slow and met with fierce resistance. The same mindset that convinced people to torture left-handed children and isolate menstruating women also created centuries of deliberate filthiness, turning basic cleanliness into a mortal sin that could literally kill you through supernatural contamination. Remember that Roman senator drinking his own urine for health? At least he was consuming something his body had produced. Medieval Europeans were so terrified of water that they chose to marinate in their own accumulated waste rather than risk the supposedly deadly consequences of being clean. You're sitting at a lavish Renaissance banquet in 16th century Italy, watching wealthy nobles feast on elaborate dishes while carefully avoiding the beautiful red fruits decorating their golden plates. These aren't just garnishes. They're tomatoes, and every aristocrat in the room believes they're looking at instruments of death. For nearly 200 years, Europe's elite lived in mortal terror of tomatoes, convinced that these innocent vegetables were sophisticated poison designed specifically to murder the wealthy and powerful. The fear wasn't entirely irrational. Rich Europeans were indeed dying after eating tomatoes, but not for the reasons they imagined. The real killer was lead poisoning from their expensive pewter plates and goblets. Tomatoes' natural acidity would leach lead from the fancy dinnerware, creating a toxic cocktail that slowly poisoned anyone wealthy enough to afford both tomatoes and lead-based serving dishes. But instead of blaming their pretentious tableware, the aristocracy decided the tomatoes themselves were cursed. Italian physicians developed elaborate theories about why tomatoes were so deadly to the upper classes while seemingly harmless to peasants. They taught that tomatoes contained, aristocratic poison, supernatural toxins that could somehow detect noble blood and target it specifically. The fruit's red color was seen as evidence of its murderous nature, resembling blood and suggesting an inherent connection to violence and death. The Catholic Church added its own layer of supernatural explanation, teaching that tomatoes were devil's apples, sent from hell to corrupt Christian society. Religious authorities pointed to the fruit's origins in the New World as proof of its demonic nature. Anything from the pagan Americas was automatically suspect. Some dioceses banned tomatoes from church grounds entirely, treating them like cursed objects that could contaminate sacred spaces. But here's where the tomato panic gets truly absurd. The fear created an elaborate black market economy around tomato testing and protection. Wealthy families employed professional food tasters, whose job was eating small amounts of tomatoes to test for poison before serving them to their employers. Some nobles hired multiple tasters, believing that aristocratic poison might require noble blood to activate, and wouldn't affect common servants. The superstitions spawned an entire industry of tomato purification methods. Enterprising merchants sold blessed tomatoes that had supposedly been cleansed of their deadly properties through religious rituals. Others offered special preparation techniques, elaborate cooking processes that claimed to neutralize the aristocratic poison while preserving the fruit's nutritional benefits. Some even sold antidote wines, designed to counteract tomato poisoning if consumed within hours of exposure. Archaeological evidence is inconclusive about whether the tomato fear actually prevented more deaths than it caused, but the social consequences were enormous. The ban on tomatoes among the wealthy created a bizarre class divide where the poor ate nutritious, vitamin-rich tomatoes while the rich suffered from scurvy and other diseases caused by avoiding this healthy food source. The most extreme cases involved entire noble families developing elaborate tomato avoidance protocols. They would inspect every dish for hidden tomato contamination, employ servants to taste test any suspicious red sauces, and some even banned the color red from their dining rooms to avoid psychological triggers that might make them accidentally consume the deadly fruit. Certain aristocratic households maintained detailed records of every family member's tomato exposure, tracking potential poisoning symptoms for months after any suspected contact. Medieval medicine contributed to the panic by developing increasingly bizarre treatments for tomato poisoning. Physicians prescribed bloodletting to remove contaminated blood, induced vomiting to expel the poison, and even performed trepanation in severe cases, believing that tomato toxins could affect the brain and required surgical intervention. These treatments were often more dangerous than any actual tomato consumption, but the medical establishment was convinced they were fighting a sophisticated poison that required aggressive countermeasures. The fear created its own self-fulfilling prophecy through psychosomatic effects. Nobles who accidentally consumed tomatoes would often develop real symptoms, nausea, weakness, and even fainting, purely from terror and expectation. These genuine physical reactions reinforced the belief that tomatoes were indeed deadly, creating a cycle of fear that persisted for generations. Some European courts developed elaborate diplomatic protocols around tomato avoidance. Foreign ambassadors were briefed on local tomato taboos to avoid accidentally poisoning their hosts or being accused of assassination attempts. International treaties sometimes included clauses about tomato handling, and some royal marriages were nearly cancelled when one family discovered the other's casual attitude toward the deadly fruit. The most disturbing aspect was how tomato fear intersected with accusations of witchcraft and poisoning. Women who grew or prepared tomatoes faced suspicion of practicing dark magic or plotting against the nobility. Some witch trials included evidence of tomato cultivation as proof of malevolent intent, and several accused witches were executed partly because they had been seen handling the cursed fruit without apparent harm. Religious authorities capitalized on tomato fears by selling protective amulets, blessed salt for purifying contaminated kitchens, and special prayers for anyone who had been exposed to the devil's apples. They developed elaborate blessing ceremonies for households that needed to remove tomato contamination, treating the fruit like a demonic presence that required exorcism. The decline of tomato superstitions came gradually as trade expanded and people observed that tomato-eating cultures in Spain and the Americas weren't dropping dead en masse. But the transition was slow and met with fierce resistance from medical authorities who had built entire careers around treating aristocratic tomato poisoning. The irony is that while wealthy Europeans were dying from lead poisoning and blaming innocent tomatoes, poor people who couldn't afford fancy pewter dishes were eating tomatoes safely from wooden bowls and clay plates. The same class privilege that provided access to expensive dinnerware was literally killing the aristocracy. But they were so convinced of their own superiority that they blamed the food rather than their pretentious serving dishes. Remember those medieval Europeans who refused to bathe because they thought water would kill them? At least their fear was based on invisible disease vapors. Renaissance aristocrats were so terrified of tomatoes that they created an entire mythology around vegetable-based assassination, turning dinner into a potential death sentence and transforming innocent fruits into weapons of mass destruction. You're lying on a wooden table in a medieval monastery infirmary, watching Brother Augustine sharpen his blade while explaining how he's about to save your life by draining the evil humors from your blood. You've come here with a simple headache, but according to medieval medical wisdom, your pain is caused by an excess of hot, corrupt blood that needs to be released before it poisons your entire system. The monk approaches with a gleaming knife, ready to open your veins and let your life force pour into a wooden bowl, convinced that making you weaker will somehow make you stronger. Bloodletting wasn't some desperate last resort. It was the cornerstone of medieval medicine, prescribed for everything from broken bones to depression to plague. The theory seemed logical to medieval minds. The human body contained 4 essential humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, and illness occurred when these fluids became imbalanced. Since blood was considered the most volatile humor, removing excess quantities could supposedly cure any ailment by restoring the body's natural equilibrium. Medieval physicians developed an incredibly sophisticated system around bloodletting, with detailed charts showing exactly how much blood to drain for different conditions. A headache required 1 cup of blood, fever demanded 2 cups, and serious illnesses like pneumonia called for draining blood until the patient fainted. They believed that fainting was actually a good sign, proof that the corrupt humors had been successfully expelled and the body was resetting itself to healthy balance. The Catholic Church embraced bloodletting as spiritually beneficial, teaching that blood contained not just physical impurities but also moral contamination from sin. Monks would undergo regular bloodletting as a form of purification, believing that draining their blood could literally remove evil thoughts and temptations. Some monasteries scheduled communal bloodletting sessions where entire communities would be bled simultaneously, treating it like a religious cleansing ritual. But here's where medieval bloodletting gets truly horrifying. They developed increasingly elaborate methods for extracting blood, each supposedly more effective than simple cutting. Physicians used leeches for gentle bloodletting, believing that these creatures could sense exactly where corrupt blood was located and drain only the contaminated portions. They applied heated cups to create suction that would draw blood through the skin, and some even used specialized tools to puncture specific veins associated with different organs and ailments. The practice created an entire medical hierarchy based on bloodletting expertise. Master physicians could allegedly determine a patient's exact condition just by examining the color, consistency, and smell of their drained blood. They developed elaborate diagnostic techniques, swirling blood samples in special bowls, holding them up to candlelight, and even tasting the blood to identify specific imbalances that required further treatment. Anthropologists disagree about whether bloodletting's popularity stemmed from genuine observed benefits, or if it persisted purely through medical tradition and placebo effects. What's certain is that the practice often hastened death rather than preventing it, weakening already sick patients and making them more vulnerable to the very diseases physicians were trying to cure. The most extreme practitioners took bloodletting to absolutely insane lengths. Some medieval doctors prescribed prophylactic bleeding, regular blood drainage for healthy people to prevent future illness. Wealthy families would schedule monthly bloodletting sessions for their entire households, including children, believing that preventive blood loss could ward off plague, evil spirits, and even bad luck. Certain physicians recommended draining specific amounts of blood during different seasons, claiming that spring blood was more toxic than winter blood and required more aggressive removal. Medieval medicine added layers of astrological complexity to bloodletting procedures. Physicians consulted star charts to determine the optimal timing for blood drainage, believing that celestial influences affected the potency of different humors. They taught that bleeding during a full moon was more effective than bleeding during a new moon, and that certain zodiac signs made blood more or less toxic depending on the patient's birth date. The practice spawned elaborate social rituals around blood drainage. Wealthy patients would invite friends and family to witness their bloodletting sessions, treating them like social events where the quantity and quality of drained blood became topics of conversation and comparison. Some nobles competed to see who could endure the most blood loss, treating extreme drainage as a sign of spiritual strength and medical sophistication. Religious authorities capitalized on bloodletting fears by selling blessed blades, holy leeches, and special prayers designed to enhance the spiritual benefits of blood drainage. They developed elaborate blessing ceremonies for bloodletting tools, treating the implements like sacred objects that could channel divine healing power. Some monasteries even claimed to possess miraculous leeches that had been blessed by saints and could perform supernatural healing through their blood-sucking abilities. The most disturbing aspect was how bloodletting became a cure-all for mental and emotional problems. Physicians prescribed blood drainage for depression, anxiety, anger, and even romantic heartbreak, believing that psychological distress was caused by corrupt blood affecting the brain. They would drain blood from specific locations on the head and neck, convinced that targeted bleeding could remove the physical substances causing emotional turmoil. Some medieval communities developed public bloodletting festivals where entire populations would gather for mass blood drainage events. These occasions combined medical treatment with religious ceremony and social celebration, creating bizarre spectacles where hundreds of people would be bled simultaneously while crowds cheered and musicians played. The festivals were seen as community purification events that could protect entire towns from plague, famine, and supernatural attack. The decline of bloodletting came gradually as physicians began observing that patients often died from the treatment rather than their original ailments. But the practice persisted well into the 18th century, with some doctors continuing to prescribe blood drainage even after scientific medicine had proven its dangers. The irony is that while medieval doctors were deliberately weakening their patients through blood loss, they were convinced they were providing the most advanced medical care available. The same mindset that made people terrified of tomatoes and convinced them that bathing would kill them also created a medical system where the cure was often more deadly than the disease, turning healing into a form of ritualized self-harm that masqueraded as sophisticated science. Remember that Roman senator drinking his own urine for health? At least he was putting something back into his body. Medieval physicians were so convinced that illness came from having too much life force that they literally drained their patients' vitality away, 1 cup of blood at a time. You're watching an ancient Peruvian shaman prepare for the most sacred healing ritual in his culture, but instead of gathering herbs or mixing potions, he's selecting the perfect stone drill bit and sharpening it to a razor edge. His patient, a young warrior complaining of persistent headaches, lies calmly on a stone altar, fully conscious and trusting, as the shaman positions the drill against his skull. This isn't torture or execution. This is cutting-edge medical technology. Because for thousands of years, cultures across the globe genuinely believed that boring holes directly into people's heads was the most effective way to cure everything from migraines to madness to bad moods. Trepanation, the practice of drilling, scraping, or cutting holes in the skull, wasn't some primitive butchery performed by ignorant savages. Archaeological evidence shows that ancient surgeons achieved survival rates of over 80% for these procedures, using sophisticated techniques that wouldn't be out of place in a modern operating room. They understood anatomy, infection control, and pain management well enough to perform brain surgery with stone tools while keeping their patients alive and functional. The logic behind trepanation seemed unshakable to ancient minds. Mental and physical ailments were caused by evil spirits, corrupt vapors, or excess pressure trapped inside the skull. Creating a hole would provide an escape route for these harmful influences, allowing the patient's natural healing forces to restore balance and health. The bigger the hole, the more effective the treatment. Some skulls show multiple trepanation sites, evidence of patients who returned for additional tune-ups throughout their lives. Ancient cultures developed elaborate spiritual explanations for why skull drilling was so effective. Shamans taught that the human head contained a spiritual battleground where good and evil forces constantly struggled for control. Mental illness, headaches, and behavioral problems were signs that evil spirits were winning the battle and needed to be given an exit route. The trepanation hole served as a doorway through which demons could be expelled and beneficial spirits could enter. But here's where ancient brain surgery gets truly remarkable. Different cultures independently developed nearly identical techniques despite having no contact with each other. Peruvian shamans, African healers, and European physicians all used similar tools, followed comparable procedures, and achieved similar success rates. This suggests that trepanation actually provided some genuine medical benefits, though not for the supernatural reasons practitioners believed. The most sophisticated trepanation procedures involved elaborate preparation rituals that would impress modern surgeons. Practitioners would fast for days, purify their tools with fire and sacred herbs, and enter trance states to commune with healing spirits before beginning surgery. They used natural anesthetics like coca leaves, alcohol, and various plant extracts to manage pain, and developed infection prevention techniques that included cleaning wounds with honey, wine, and antimicrobial plant compounds. Recent studies challenge the assumption that trepanation was purely superstitious, suggesting that the procedure may have provided real relief for certain conditions like chronic headaches, epilepsy, and traumatic brain injuries. The pressure release from skull drilling could potentially alleviate symptoms caused by brain swelling, blood clots, or other physical problems that ancient surgeons couldn't directly observe but could effectively treat through trepanation. Ancient physicians developed incredibly detailed diagnostic criteria for determining when trepanation was necessary. They examined patients' behavior, sleep patterns, and physical symptoms to identify the specific type of spiritual contamination affecting the brain. Different demons supposedly caused different symptoms, requiring precisely positioned holes to ensure effective exorcism. Some practitioners claimed they could actually see evil spirits escaping through the trepanation holes, describing the demon's appearance and behavior as they fled the patient's skull. The practice created elaborate social hierarchies around brain surgery expertise. Master trepanation surgeons commanded enormous respect and compensation, traveling between communities to perform procedures that local healers couldn't attempt. They developed secret techniques passed down through generations, with some families maintaining trepanation traditions for centuries. The most skilled practitioners could allegedly determine the exact location and size of hole needed just by examining a patient's symptoms and spiritual aura. Medieval European physicians added their own medical theories to trepanation, teaching that skull drilling could rebalance the four humors by releasing excess pressure from corrupted brain fluids. They developed elaborate charts showing which areas of the skull to drill for different conditions, believing that specific brain regions controlled particular aspects of personality and health. Some medieval trepanation procedures were performed to cure moral failings like greed, lust, or pride, treating character flaws as medical conditions requiring surgical intervention. The most extreme cases involved voluntary trepanation by people seeking spiritual enlightenment or enhanced mental abilities. Some ancient cultures believed that skull holes could improve communication with gods, enhance psychic abilities, or provide access to hidden knowledge. Religious mystics would undergo multiple trepanation procedures throughout their lives, accumulating holes like spiritual merit badges that demonstrated their dedication to transcendental experiences. Certain communities developed public trepanation ceremonies where skull drilling became a rite of passage or community celebration. Young warriors would prove their courage by undergoing trepanation without showing pain, while spiritual leaders would perform the procedures as demonstrations of their healing powers. These events combined medical treatment with religious ritual and social bonding, creating elaborate spectacles that reinforced cultural beliefs about the connection between physical and spiritual health. The decline of trepanation came gradually as medical understanding advanced, but the practice persisted in some cultures well into the 20th century. Modern neurosurgeons have actually revived certain trepanation techniques for treating specific conditions, though they use sterile equipment and anesthesia rather than stone tools and spiritual rituals. The most fascinating aspect is that trepanation represents one of humanity's earliest attempts at brain surgery, performed by people who understood enough about anatomy and healing to achieve remarkable success rates despite having no knowledge of germs, anesthesia, or modern surgical techniques. They were drilling holes in people's heads with stone tools and keeping them alive, a feat that would challenge even modern surgeons working under similar conditions. Remember those medieval doctors who thought draining blood would cure everything? At least bloodletting was relatively simple and didn't require power tools. Ancient trepanation surgeons were performing actual brain surgery with Stone Age technology, convinced that they were creating doorways for demons while accidentally pioneering neurosurgical techniques that modern medicine still uses today. You're creeping through a moonlit medieval garden, watching a hooded figure approach a peculiar plant with trembling hands. The herbalist whispers protective prayers as he carefully digs around the roots, because he genuinely believes that disturbing this innocent-looking plant will unleash a supernatural shriek so horrifying that anyone who hears it will instantly drop dead. This isn't just any herb. This is the legendary mandrake root, and for over 1,000 years, Europeans were absolutely convinced that harvesting it was essentially committing suicide by sound. The mandrake plant became the most feared vegetation in medieval Europe, not because it was poisonous, though it certainly was, but because people believed it possessed a human soul that would scream in agony when uprooted. The root's vaguely humanoid shape, with what appeared to be arms, legs, and even facial features, convinced medieval minds that mandrakes were actually half-human, half-plant creatures that could think, feel, and express supernatural rage when disturbed. Medieval herbalists developed elaborate theories about how mandrakes acquired their deadly voices. They taught that these plants grew only in soil that had been fertilized by the blood and semen of executed criminals, absorbing the spiritual essence of the condemned and transforming it into vegetable form. The mandrake scream was supposedly the tortured soul of a hanged man expressing eternal anguish through plant vocal cords, making the sound so spiritually contaminated that it could kill through pure supernatural horror. The Catholic Church added its own layer of demonic explanation, teaching that mandrakes were Satan's attempt to create artificial life that could corrupt God's natural order. Religious authorities claimed that the devil had infused these plants with fragments of human souls stolen from purgatory, creating hybrid creatures that existed in a blasphemous state between plant and human. The deadly scream was proof of the mandrake's unnatural existence, a sound so offensive to divine creation that it could literally frighten people to death. But here's where mandrake harvesting gets absolutely insane. Medieval herbalists developed elaborate techniques for obtaining the roots without hearing the fatal scream. The most common method involved tying a rope around the plant and attaching the other end to a dog, then retreating to a safe distance and coaxing the animal to pull the mandrake from the ground. The dog would supposedly die from hearing the scream, but the herbalist could safely collect the root once the deadly sound had dissipated. The practice created an entire industry around mandrake procurement that would make modern pharmaceutical companies jealous. Professional mandrake hunters commanded enormous fees for their dangerous work, and some developed elaborate protective equipment including wax ear plugs, blessed amulets, and even specially trained deaf assistants who couldn't be harmed by supernatural sounds. The most expensive mandrakes were those harvested during specific lunar phases or astrological conditions that supposedly enhanced their magical properties. Cross-cultural analysis reveals conflicting interpretations of mandrak mythology, with some cultures viewing the plants as beneficial while others considered them purely evil. What's consistent across all traditions is the belief that mandrakes possess some form of consciousness and could communicate through supernatural means, making them fundamentally different from ordinary plants. The most extreme practitioners developed elaborate rituals around mandrak cultivation and harvesting. Some medieval gardens included special mandrak sections, where the plants were grown under carefully controlled conditions, fed with specific types of blood, and serenaded with particular songs that supposedly influenced their spiritual development. Certain herbalists claimed they could communicate with mandrakes telepathically, negotiating with the plants' souls before attempting to harvest their roots. Medieval medicine elevated mandrak roots to miraculous status, prescribing them for everything from infertility to insomnia to demonic possession. The roots were so valuable that fake mandrakes became a thriving black market commodity, with unscrupulous dealers carving ordinary roots into humanoid shapes and selling them to desperate customers. Some forgeries were so sophisticated that they included fake screaming mechanisms, hidden whistles, or other devices that would make sounds when the root was disturbed. The superstition created bizarre social dynamics around mandrak ownership. Wealthy families would display their mandrak collections like precious art, hosting dinner parties where guests could admire the various root shapes and hear stories about their dangerous acquisition. Some nobles employed professional mandrak caretakers whose job was maintaining the root's spiritual well-being through regular feeding, cleaning, and conversation. Religious authorities capitalized on mandrak fears by selling blessed containers, holy oils for root preservation, and special prayers for protection against mandrak screams. They developed elaborate blessing ceremonies for newly harvested roots, treating them like captured demons that required spiritual containment. Some monasteries even claimed to possess holy mandrakes, roots that had been purified through religious ritual and could be safely handled without supernatural danger. The most disturbing aspect was how mandrak beliefs intersected with accusations of witchcraft and sorcery. Women who possessed mandrak roots faced suspicion of practicing dark magic, since the plants were essential ingredients in many alleged spells and curses. Some witch trials included evidence of mandrak cultivation as proof of supernatural activity, and several accused witches were executed partly because they had been found with suspicious root collections. Certain medieval communities developed elaborate protocols for dealing with accidental mandrak encounters. If someone stumbled upon a wild mandrak, they were supposed to immediately retreat, alert local authorities, and wait for professional herbalists to safely remove the dangerous plant. Some villages maintained emergency response teams specifically trained in mandrak management, treating wild root discoveries like hazardous material incidents that required specialized expertise. The decline of mandrak superstitions came gradually as botanical knowledge advanced and people began understanding plant biology. But the transition was slow and met with fierce resistance from herbalists who had built entire careers around supernatural root harvesting. Even today, some traditional medicine practitioners maintain elaborate rituals around mandrak collection, though they no longer believe the plants will literally scream them to death. The irony is that mandrak roots do contain powerful psychoactive compounds that can cause hallucinations, delirium, and even death if consumed improperly. Medieval herbalists were right to fear these plants, but for entirely wrong reasons. Instead of worrying about supernatural screams, they should have been concerned about actual chemical toxicity, a much more mundane but genuinely dangerous threat. Remember those ancient surgeons drilling holes in skulls to release demons? At least trepanation was performed on willing patients who understood the risks. Medieval mandrake hunters were so terrified of imaginary plant screams that they developed elaborate techniques for harvesting herbs without hearing them, turning simple gardening into a life-or-death supernatural encounter that required specialized equipment and professional expertise. You're standing in the town square of a medieval German village, watching as the entire community gathers around elderly Greta, the local herb woman, pointing accusatory fingers and shouting about the devastating hailstorm that destroyed their crops 3 days ago. But this isn't a discussion about weather patterns or agricultural insurance. These people genuinely believe that Greta summoned the storm through demonic magic, controlling the very forces of nature to punish her neighbors for some perceived slight. Welcome to a world where your local wise woman wasn't just a healer and midwife, she was a suspected weather terrorist with supernatural powers over rain, wind, and lightning. The belief in witches' weather control abilities wasn't limited to ignorant peasants. It was codified into law, supported by church doctrine, and accepted by the most educated minds of medieval Europe. Legal documents from witch trials contain detailed testimony about accused women allegedly causing droughts, floods, tornadoes, and blizzards through supernatural means. Courts treated weather magic as seriously as murder or treason, with some jurisdictions prescribing death specifically for the crime of malevolent meteorological manipulation. Medieval theologians developed elaborate explanations for how witches could control weather systems. They taught that Satan had granted certain women the power to command atmospheric demons, supernatural entities that controlled wind, rain, and temperature. These weather demons supposedly lived in the sky, waiting for instructions from their earthly witch allies who could summon storms, redirect rainfall, or create unseasonable temperature changes through ritual magic and demonic contracts. The Catholic Church added layers of cosmic significance to weather witchcraft, teaching that God controlled natural weather patterns while Satan could only create destructive, unnatural storms. Any weather that seemed unusual, untimely, or particularly damaging was automatically suspected as demonic intervention. Church authorities developed detailed criteria for distinguishing between divine weather and satanic weather, with unusual cloud formations, strange wind patterns, or unexpected temperature changes serving as evidence of supernatural manipulation. But here's where weather witchcraft gets truly terrifying. Entire communities would organize witch hunts based solely on coincidental timing between local conflicts and subsequent weather events. If a woman argued with her neighbors and a storm occurred within days or weeks, that correlation was considered proof of magical causation. The accused witch would face torture, trial, and often execution, all because natural weather patterns happen to align with social tensions. The superstition created elaborate systems for weather prediction and protection that would make modern meteorologists weep. Communities employed weather watchers, specialists who monitored local wise women for signs of magical activity that might indicate incoming storms. They developed early warning systems based on observing suspected witches' behavior, believing that women would exhibit specific patterns before unleashing weather magic on their communities. Scientific consensus has yet to emerge on whether which weather correlations were purely coincidental, or if some accused women actually possessed advanced knowledge of natural weather patterns that made their predictions seem supernatural. What's certain is that many weather witches were simply women who understood traditional forecasting methods based on animal behavior, atmospheric pressure changes, and seasonal patterns, knowledge that seemed magical to communities lacking scientific meteorology. The most extreme cases involved mass hysteria around weather control conspiracies. Some regions became convinced that networks of witches were coordinating large-scale weather warfare, using combined magical powers to create regional droughts, devastating storms, or unseasonable cold snaps designed to destroy entire kingdoms. These paranoid fantasies led to coordinated witch hunts across multiple communities, with authorities torturing suspects to extract confessions about their alleged participation in supernatural weather conspiracies. Medieval medicine added its own layer of complexity to weather witchcraft beliefs. Physicians taught that certain women's bodies were naturally attuned to atmospheric changes, making them more susceptible to demonic influence during specific weather conditions. They developed elaborate theories about how menstrual cycles, emotional states, and spiritual contamination could enhance a woman's ability to channel weather demons, creating detailed profiles of who was most likely to develop supernatural meteorological powers. The practice spawned elaborate protection rituals designed to defend communities against weather witchcraft. Churches sold blessed bells that could supposedly dispel storm demons when rung during suspicious weather events. Some communities built special weather towers, equipped with holy relics and protective symbols designed to create supernatural barriers against magical storms. Certain villages even employed professional weather priests, whose sole job was performing protective rituals during threatening atmospheric conditions. Religious authorities capitalized on weather fears by selling storm protection services, blessed amulets against magical weather, and special prayers for communities threatened by suspected weather witches. They developed elaborate exorcism procedures for cleansing areas that had been contaminated by supernatural storms, treating weather magic like demonic possession that required divine intervention to remove. The most disturbing aspect was how weather witchcraft accusations often targeted women who were simply more observant about natural patterns than their neighbors. Midwives, herbalists, and elderly women who had accumulated decades of experience reading environmental signs would be accused of magic when their weather predictions proved accurate. Their genuine knowledge of natural forecasting methods was reinterpreted as evidence of supernatural powers, turning expertise into a death sentence. Some medieval communities developed elaborate weather documentation systems designed to identify patterns in suspected magical activity. They maintained detailed records of local conflicts, weather events, and the behavior of suspected witches, creating databases that they believed could predict future supernatural storms. These records were often used as evidence in witch trials, with prosecutors arguing that statistical correlations proved magical causation. The decline of weather witchcraft beliefs came gradually as scientific meteorology advanced and people began understanding natural atmospheric processes. But the transition was slow and met with fierce resistance from communities that had organized their entire social structures around weather magic fears. Even today, some traditional cultures maintain beliefs about individuals who can influence weather through supernatural means. The irony is that many accused whether witches were actually the most scientifically minded members of their communities. Women who observed natural patterns, understood seasonal cycles, and could make educated predictions about atmospheric changes. Instead of being celebrated for their knowledge, they were persecuted for possessing information that seemed too accurate to be natural. Remember those medieval herbalists who were terrified of mandrake screams? At least they were only afraid of individual plants. Whether witchcraft paranoia turned every unusual cloud formation into evidence of supernatural conspiracy, transforming the entire atmosphere into a battlefield between good and evil where local wise women were suspected of commanding armies of demonic storms. You're sitting in an ancient Greek household, watching as the family matriarch examines her pregnant daughter-in-law's belly with the intensity of a modern ultrasound technician. But instead of using medical equipment, she's relying on a bizarre collection of supposed pregnancy indicators: the shape of the woman's navel, the direction her hair grows, and whether she craves sweet or salty foods. This isn't casual curiosity. The entire family's future depends on knowing whether they're expecting a boy or girl, because ancient cultures developed elaborate systems for predicting unborn babies' gender that were somehow considered more reliable than modern medical science. The obsession with predicting baby gender wasn't just entertainment. It was a matter of economic survival, inheritance planning, and social status. In patriarchal societies, producing male heirs determined everything from property rights to family alliances to religious obligations. Ancient families would spend enormous resources on gender prediction methods, consulting multiple specialists and performing elaborate rituals to determine whether the developing child would be the coveted son or the disappointing daughter. Ancient Egyptian physicians developed incredibly detailed belly-watching techniques that supposedly revealed the baby's gender through subtle changes in the mother's abdominal shape. They taught that boys caused the belly to point forward and slightly to the right, while girls made it spread wider and sit lower. Egyptian midwives could allegedly determine gender as early as the 3rd month of pregnancy just by observing how the woman's body was changing, creating elaborate charts that correlated specific belly measurements with male or female development. The Greeks took gender prediction to even more bizarre extremes, developing urine mixing experiments that claimed to reveal the baby's sex through chemical reactions. Pregnant women would mix their urine with wine, oil, or various plant extracts, then observe the resulting colors, textures, and smells to determine whether they were carrying a boy or girl. Different mixtures supposedly reacted differently to male versus female hormones, creating a primitive form of pregnancy testing that was completely useless, but absolutely trusted. But here's where ancient gender prediction gets truly absurd. They developed elaborate dream interpretation systems where the content of pregnant women's dreams supposedly revealed their baby's gender. Dreams about weapons, animals, or aggressive activities indicated boys, while dreams about flowers, water, or peaceful scenes suggested girls. Some cultures employed professional dream interpreters whose sole job was analyzing pregnant women's sleep visions to predict their children's gender. Medieval European physicians added their own layer of pseudoscientific complexity to gender prediction, teaching that the baby's sex could be determined by examining the mother's complexion, hair texture, and even the way she walked. They believed that carrying boys made women's skin clearer and their hair shinier, while girls supposedly drained their mother's beauty and vitality. These observations were codified into detailed diagnostic manuals that claimed to predict gender with mathematical precision. Ethnographic research offers competing explanations for why gender prediction methods were so universally trusted despite being completely unreliable. Some scholars suggest that the 50% accuracy rate of random guessing was enough to maintain belief in these systems, while others argue that the methods provided psychological comfort during the uncertainty of pregnancy, regardless of their actual effectiveness. The most extreme practitioners developed elaborate ritual systems around gender prediction that involved entire communities. Some cultures held public ceremonies where pregnant women would undergo multiple prediction tests simultaneously: belly examination, urine analysis, dream interpretation, and astrological consultation, with the results combined into a comprehensive gender forecast. These events became major social occasions that reinforced cultural beliefs about pregnancy and child-rearing. Ancient Chinese medicine contributed sophisticated astrological elements to gender prediction, developing complex charts that correlated the timing of conception with lunar phases, seasonal changes, and the mother's age to determine the baby's sex. They created elaborate mathematical formulas that supposedly calculated gender based on when the child was conceived relative to various celestial events, treating pregnancy like an astronomical phenomenon that could be predicted through cosmic calculations. The practice spawned elaborate industries around pregnancy consulting and gender prediction services. Wealthy families would employ teams of specialists, midwives, astrologers, dream interpreters, and physicians to provide comprehensive gender forecasts throughout the pregnancy. Some practitioners claimed they could not only predict the baby's sex but also influence it through specific diets, activities, or rituals performed during conception and early pregnancy. Religious authorities capitalized on gender prediction anxieties by selling blessed amulets for ensuring male births, special prayers for influencing the baby's sex, and protective rituals for families disappointed by gender predictions. They developed elaborate theological explanations for why God sometimes granted the desired sons while other times provided unwanted daughters, treating gender as a divine reward or punishment for the parent's spiritual behavior. The most disturbing aspect was how inaccurate gender predictions affected family relationships and child welfare. When babies were born with unexpected genders, families would sometimes blame the mother for deceiving them or accuse the prediction specialists of incompetence or witchcraft. Some children grew up knowing they had been unwanted because their predicted gender was wrong, creating psychological trauma that lasted throughout their lives. Certain cultures developed elaborate gender-switching rituals for families who received unwanted gender predictions. They believed that specific ceremonies, dietary changes, or magical interventions could actually alter the developing baby's sex during pregnancy, leading to desperate attempts to transform predicted girls into boys through increasingly bizarre and dangerous methods. The decline of traditional gender prediction came gradually with the development of actual medical techniques for determining fetal sex, but many cultures maintained their traditional methods alongside modern medicine. Even today, some communities continue using ancient belly watching, urine testing, and dream interpretation techniques, though usually as entertainment rather than serious medical practice. The irony is that while ancient cultures were developing elaborate pseudoscientific systems for predicting baby gender, they were completely ignoring the actual biological factors that determine sex. They created incredibly detailed methodologies for analyzing irrelevant symptoms while missing the chromosomal reality that actually controls whether a baby develops as male or female. Remember those communities that were convinced whether witches could control storms through supernatural magic? At least weather actually changes and can be observed. Ancient gender prediction specialists were so confident in their belly watching and urine mixing techniques that they built entire social systems around methods that were essentially elaborate forms of pregnancy-themed fortune-telling. You're walking through the bustling marketplace of ancient Athens, when suddenly the merchant you're negotiating with stops mid-sentence, turns his head, and spits forcefully over his left shoulder. Then he does it again. And again. This isn't disgust or rudeness. He's just noticed someone giving him what he believes is the evil eye, and he's desperately trying to protect himself from a supernatural curse that could destroy his business, his health, and his entire family. Welcome to the Mediterranean world where saliva was considered the ultimate weapon against jealousy-based magic, and people spent their days compulsively spitting to ward off the envious glances of their neighbors. The evil eye wasn't just superstition. It was a fundamental organizing principle of ancient Mediterranean society, shaping everything from architecture to social interactions to business practices. People genuinely believed that jealous or envious thoughts could manifest as invisible supernatural energy that would curse the target with misfortune, illness, or death. The only reliable defense was immediate spitting, which supposedly created a protective barrier that deflected the malevolent energy back toward its source. Ancient Greek physicians developed elaborate medical theories about how evil eye curses affected human health. They taught that envious glances could disrupt the body's natural humors, causing everything from headaches to infertility to sudden death. The mechanism was supposedly similar to poison. Jealous energy would enter through the eyes, travel through the nervous system, and contaminate the victim's vital organs. Spitting was considered a form of spiritual antidote that could neutralize the curse before it caused permanent damage. The Romans elevated evil eye protection to an art form, developing increasingly sophisticated spitting techniques for different social situations. There were specific spitting patterns for protecting against business rivals, romantic competitors, and social superiors whose envy might be particularly dangerous. Roman etiquette manuals included detailed instructions on proper spitting form, timing, and frequency, treating saliva-based protection like a crucial social skill that every civilized person needed to master. But here's where evil eye paranoia gets absolutely insane. Entire communities would engage in mass spitting events when they suspected coordinated supernatural attacks. If multiple people fell ill or experienced bad luck simultaneously, villages would organize communal spitting ceremonies where everyone would spit in unison to create collective protection against the evil eye conspiracy. These events became major social occasions that reinforced community bonds while supposedly defending against jealous outsiders. Medieval Christianity adapted evil eye beliefs to fit religious doctrine, teaching that envious thoughts were a form of sin that could manifest as supernatural curses. The Catholic Church developed elaborate blessing ceremonies for people who believed they had been cursed, but also maintained that spitting was an acceptable form of spiritual self-defense. Some monasteries even included spitting techniques in their training programs, teaching monks how to protect themselves against the envious thoughts of secular visitors. Archaeological evidence suggests that evil eye beliefs were so pervasive that they influenced urban planning and architectural design. Many ancient buildings include specific features designed to confuse or deflect envious glances, irregular window patterns, decorative elements that supposedly absorb jealous energy, and even built in spitting stations where residents could quickly perform protective rituals when threatened by supernatural attack. The most extreme practitioners developed elaborate lifestyle modifications around evil eye avoidance. Some wealthy families would disguise their prosperity to avoid attracting envious attention, while others employed professional evil eye watchers, whose job was monitoring social interactions for signs of jealous glances that might require immediate spitting countermeasures. Certain individuals became so paranoid about supernatural curses that they would spit continuously throughout the day, treating saliva production like a full-time job. Ancient Mediterranean cultures created complex social hierarchies around evil eye vulnerability and protection abilities. People with unusual eye colors, particularly striking appearances, or notable success were considered especially dangerous sources of envious energy. Conversely, individuals who were skilled at spitting techniques or had reputations for effective curse deflection commanded respect and social status as supernatural protectors. The practice spawned elaborate industries around evil eye detection and protection services. Professional curse identifiers claimed they could determine whether someone had been affected by jealous glances through various diagnostic techniques, while spitting instructors offered training in advanced saliva-based defense methods. Some entrepreneurs even sold enhanced spitting solutions, special mouth rinses that supposedly made saliva more effective at deflecting supernatural curses. Religious authorities capitalized on evil eye fears by selling blessed amulets, holy water for enhanced spitting effectiveness, and special prayers for protection against envious curses. They developed elaborate theological explanations for why God allowed jealous thoughts to manifest as supernatural attacks, treating evil eye beliefs as part of divine justice where envy was both sin and punishment simultaneously. The most disturbing aspect was how evil eye paranoia destroyed social trust and community cohesion. People became afraid to express admiration, success, or happiness because any positive emotion might be interpreted as dangerous envy requiring protective spitting. Compliments became suspect, celebrations were muted, and social interactions were constantly interrupted by defensive saliva rituals that turned normal conversation into supernatural warfare. Some Mediterranean communities developed elaborate protocols for managing evil eye risks during important events like weddings, business deals, or religious ceremonies. These occasions required coordinated spitting schedules, designated curse watchers, and sometimes even professional spitting specialists who could provide enhanced protection during vulnerable moments when envious attacks were most likely to occur. The decline of evil eye spitting came gradually as scientific understanding of disease and misfortune advanced, but the beliefs persisted in many Mediterranean cultures well into the modern era. Even today, some traditional communities maintain spitting rituals for protection against jealous glances, though usually as cultural tradition rather than genuine supernatural defense. The irony is that evil eye beliefs created the very social tensions they were supposed to protect against. By treating every envious thought as a potential supernatural weapon, these cultures turn normal human emotions like admiration and jealousy into sources of constant fear and defensive behavior. The cure became worse than the disease, transforming entire societies into paranoid communities where people spent their days spitting at each other in elaborate rituals of mutual suspicion. Remember those ancient families who developed elaborate techniques for predicting their baby's gender through belly watching and urine mixing? At least pregnancy prediction only affected individual families. Evil-eye paranoia turned every social interaction into a potential supernatural battle, creating cultures where people couldn't express normal emotions without triggering defensive spitting rituals that treated human jealousy like a contagious magical disease. You're standing in the sacred temple of ancient Babylon, watching the high priest carefully examine the steaming liver of a freshly sacrificed sheep, his face grave with concentration as he searches for divine messages hidden in the organ's texture, color, and blood vessel patterns. This isn't just religious ritual, this is cutting-edge meteorological science. Because for over 3,000 years, civilizations across the globe genuinely believe that the internal organs of animals contain detailed weather forecasts, military intelligence, and economic predictions that were more reliable than any human observation or natural phenomenon. Animal sacrifice for divination wasn't primitive superstition practiced by ignorant tribes. It was sophisticated technology employed by the most advanced civilizations in human history. Babylonian priests developed incredibly detailed manuals for reading sheep livers, with elaborate charts showing how different organ abnormalities corresponded to specific future events. A dark spot on the liver's left lobe might indicate drought, while unusual blood vessel patterns could predict enemy invasions or royal deaths. Ancient Roman augurs elevated bird watching to a precise science, believing that the flight patterns, feeding behavior, and vocalizations of different bird species contained coded messages from the gods about future weather conditions and political events. They developed elaborate classification systems for interpreting avian omens, with specific meanings assigned to everything from the direction eagles flew to the way chickens pecked at scattered grain. No major military campaign or political decision was made without consulting the sacred chickens. The Greeks added their own layer of complexity to animal divination, teaching that different species were connected to different gods and therefore provided specialized types of prophetic information. Sheep were associated with agricultural forecasts, birds with weather patterns, and horses with military outcomes. Greek oracles would sacrifice multiple animals simultaneously, combining their various organ readings into comprehensive predictions that supposedly revealed the gods' detailed plans for human affairs. But here's where animal sacrifice divination gets truly elaborate. Ancient cultures developed entire governmental systems based on animal-derived predictions. Babylonian kings employed teams of professional liver readers who would examine dozens of sacrificed animals daily, creating detailed reports about upcoming weather patterns, enemy movements, and economic conditions. These predictions influenced everything from military strategy to tax policy to agricultural planning, making animal organs the foundation of state decision-making. The practice created elaborate industries around divination, animal breeding, and organ interpretation. Certain farms specialized in raising prophetic livestock, animals that were supposedly more spiritually sensitive, and therefore provided clearer divine messages when sacrificed. Professional organ readers commanded enormous salaries and political influence, since their interpretations could determine whether kingdoms went to war or made peace. Modern anthropological studies remain inconclusive about whether animal divination actually provided useful information or if its persistence was purely based on confirmation bias and selective memory. What's certain is that many ancient civilizations achieved remarkable military and economic success while relying heavily on animal sacrifice predictions, suggesting either that the method had some practical value or that other factors were responsible for their achievements. The most extreme practitioners developed elaborate ritual protocols around animal sacrifice that would make modern scientific procedures seem casual by comparison. Babylonian priests would fast for days before major divination sessions, purify themselves with specific ceremonies, and use consecrated knives that had been blessed through elaborate religious rituals. The animals themselves were examined for spiritual purity before sacrifice, with only perfect specimens considered capable of providing accurate divine messages. Ancient Chinese divination added sophisticated astronomical elements to animal sacrifice, correlating organ readings with celestial events to create comprehensive forecasting systems. They developed complex mathematical formulas that supposedly calculated the accuracy of different predictions based on the timing of sacrifice relative to lunar phases, planetary positions, and seasonal changes. Chinese emperors employed entire departments of animal divination specialists who provided daily briefings on supernatural intelligence gathered from sacrificed livestock. The practice spawned elaborate educational systems for training professional diviners. Ancient temples maintained schools where students spent years learning to interpret animal organs, memorizing thousands of possible organ configurations and their corresponding meanings. Master diviners could allegedly determine everything from next year's harvest quality to the outcome of specific battles just by examining a sheep's liver or observing how sacred birds behaved during feeding time. Religious authorities developed elaborate theological explanations for why gods chose to communicate through animal organs and bird behavior rather than direct revelation. They taught that divine messages were too powerful for human minds to receive directly, so the gods filtered their communications through animal intermediaries that could safely convey supernatural information without destroying mortal recipients. This made animal sacrifice not just divination but also a form of spiritual protection. The most disturbing aspect was how animal divination predictions influenced major historical events. Wars were started, peace treaties were signed, and entire populations were relocated based on how priests interpreted sheep livers or bird flight patterns. Some of history's most significant decisions were made not through rational analysis but through elaborate interpretations of animal organ abnormalities that were essentially random biological variations. Certain cultures developed elaborate backup systems for when animal divination provided conflicting or unclear messages. They would sacrifice multiple animals of different species, consult various types of omens simultaneously, and sometimes even repeat entire divination procedures if the initial results seemed unfavorable. Some rulers became so dependent on animal predictions that they would postpone major decisions for weeks while waiting for clearer supernatural guidance. The decline of animal sacrifice divination came gradually as scientific understanding of weather patterns and military intelligence advanced, but the practice persisted in some cultures well into the medieval period. Even today, some traditional societies maintain forms of animal-based divination, though usually for personal rather than governmental decision-making. The irony is that while ancient civilizations were developing incredibly sophisticated systems for reading divine messages in sheep livers and bird behavior, they were ignoring the actual natural phenomena that could have provided genuine predictive information. They created elaborate methodologies for interpreting random biological variations while missing the real environmental patterns that actually influenced weather, agriculture, and military outcomes. Remember those Mediterranean cultures where people spent their days compulsively spitting to ward off evil eye curses? At least their paranoia was based on human social interactions. Animal sacrifice, divination turned random organ abnormalities and bird behavior into the foundation of governmental policy, creating civilizations that made their most important decisions based on essentially reading tea leaves and sheep intestines. You're walking through the shadowy streets of medieval Transylvania, clutching a string of garlic bulbs like your life depends on it. Because according to everyone around you, it literally does. The year is 1456, and Vlad the Impaler's brutal reign has convinced the local population that the undead are rising from their graves to feast on human blood. But this isn't just folklore or entertainment. Medieval Europeans genuinely believed that vampires were a real and present danger, and that garlic was the only thing standing between them and eternal damnation as blood-sucking monsters. The vampire panic wasn't limited to remote mountain villages or ignorant peasants. Educated clergy, respected physicians, and even royal courts took vampire threats seriously enough to develop elaborate protection protocols and official response procedures. Church documents from the 15th century contain detailed instructions for identifying vampire attacks, protecting communities from undead infiltration, and using garlic-based defenses to create supernatural barriers against blood-sucking demons. Medieval theologians developed sophisticated explanations for why garlic was so effective against vampires. They taught that these undead creatures were essentially demons inhabiting corpses, and that garlic's pungent smell was spiritually offensive to evil entities. The stronger the garlic's odor, the more powerful its protective properties, leading to an arms race where people would consume increasingly large quantities of raw garlic to maximize their supernatural defense capabilities. The Catholic Church initially condemned vampire beliefs as pagan superstition, but eventually embraced garlic protection when communities began reporting successful vampire encounters that seemed to validate the practice. Religious authorities developed elaborate blessing ceremonies for garlic bulbs, treating them like holy weapons that required divine consecration to achieve maximum effectiveness against undead attacks. Some monasteries even maintained special garlic gardens where the bulbs were grown under constant prayer and religious supervision. But here's where medieval vampire protection gets absolutely ridiculous. Entire communities would organize coordinated garlic defense systems that turned towns into pungent fortresses against supernatural attack. Villages would require all residents to wear garlic necklaces, hang garlic bundles from every doorway, and consume daily garlic rations to maintain collective protection. The smell must have been overwhelming, but people genuinely believed their survival depended on maintaining maximum garlic saturation. The practice created elaborate industries around garlic cultivation, processing, and distribution that rivaled modern pharmaceutical companies. Professional garlic specialists developed enhanced varieties with stronger odors, created concentrated garlic oils for maximum potency, and even offered garlic delivery services for families too terrified to venture outside during suspected vampire activity. Some entrepreneurs became wealthy selling vampire-grade garlic that supposedly provided superior protection against undead attacks. Contemporary historical analysis suggests that vampire beliefs may have originated from misunderstood medical conditions like porphyria, rabies, or decomposition processes that created apparently supernatural symptoms. However, the garlic protection methods were so universally trusted that they became embedded in European culture regardless of their actual effectiveness against any real threats. The most extreme practitioners developed elaborate lifestyle modifications around vampire avoidance and garlic-based protection. Some families would relocate to areas with naturally high garlic concentrations, while others employed professional, vampire watchers, whose job was monitoring local cemeteries for signs of undead activity that might require enhanced garlic defenses. Certain individuals became so paranoid about vampire attacks that they would consume nothing but garlic-based foods, essentially poisoning themselves with their own protection methods. Medieval medicine added its own layer of complexity to vampire protection, teaching that garlic not only repelled undead creatures but also prevented living people from becoming vampires after death. Physicians prescribed specific garlic consumption schedules for different age groups and health conditions, believing that proper garlic intake could immunize people against vampire transformation even if they were bitten by undead attackers. The superstitions spawned elaborate social rituals around garlic sharing and community protection. Wealthy families would host garlic parties, where guests would consume large quantities of raw garlic while sharing vampire encounter stories and protection techniques. These events became important social occasions that reinforced community bonds while supposedly strengthening collective supernatural defenses. Religious authorities capitalized on vampire fears by selling blessed garlic products, holy oils for enhancing garlic effectiveness, and special prayers for protection against undead attacks. They developed elaborate exorcism procedures for areas that had been contaminated by vampire presence, treating undead encounters like demonic infestations that required divine intervention to cleanse. The most disturbing aspect was how vampire paranoia affected death and burial practices. Communities would perform elaborate garlic-based rituals on corpses to prevent them from rising as vampires, sometimes even staking bodies through the heart while stuffing their mouths with garlic bulbs. These practices created additional trauma for grieving families who had to watch their loved ones being treated like potential monsters. Some medieval regions developed elaborate vampire detection systems that relied heavily on garlic testing. They believed that suspected vampires would be unable to tolerate garlic's presence, so communities would use garlic exposure as a diagnostic tool for identifying undead infiltrators. Anyone who seemed uncomfortable around garlic faced suspicion of vampire transformation, leading to persecution of people with garlic allergies or simply different cultural food preferences. The decline of vampire beliefs came gradually as scientific understanding of death and disease advanced, but garlic protection methods persisted in many European cultures well into the modern era. Even today, garlic remains associated with supernatural protection in popular culture, though most people no longer genuinely believe in its vampire-repelling properties. The irony is that while medieval Europeans were developing elaborate garlic-based defense systems against imaginary vampires, they were ignoring real threats like plague, warfare, and famine that were actually killing thousands of people. They created incredibly detailed methodologies for protecting against supernatural bloodsuckers while remaining vulnerable to genuine dangers that required practical rather than aromatic solutions. The most fascinating aspect is how vampire beliefs represented the culmination of all the supernatural fears we've explored tonight. Like those ancient Egyptians smearing crocodile dung on their faces, medieval Europeans were convinced that natural substances could provide supernatural protection. Like those communities terrified of weather witches and evil eye curses, they organized their entire social structures around defending against imaginary threats that seemed more real than actual dangers. And now, as you drift towards sleep, Imagine how future generations might look back at our own seemingly rational beliefs and practices. What modern superstitions are we clinging to without realizing their absurdity? What elaborate systems have we built around fears that will seem as ridiculous to our descendants as garlic-wielding vampire hunters seem to us? The human need to find patterns, assign meaning, and create protection against the unknown hasn't disappeared. It's just evolved. We still seek magical solutions to complex problems, still blame invisible forces for misfortune, and still convince ourselves that simple rituals can protect us from life's uncertainties. The only difference is that we call our superstitions by different names and dress them in modern language. Perhaps the real lesson isn't that our ancestors were foolish, but that human nature remains fundamentally unchanged. We're all still searching for control in an unpredictable world, still hoping that the right combination of actions and beliefs can keep us safe from the darkness that surrounds us. And maybe, in our own way, we're still carrying garlic against vampires. We just don't recognize the smell anymore. Sleep well, knowing that the same curiosity and hope that drove our ancestors to such elaborate extremes also drives our continued quest for understanding, protection, and meaning in an endlessly mysterious universe. Sweet dreams, and may your own protective rituals, whatever they might be, bring you the comfort and security that garlic once provided to those who came before us.